Hey Retromancers, Keith here, back from a bit of a hiatus in the Upside Down, saving all your lives, just in time for the start of Stranger Things Season 2. Now, I love Stranger Things, as I'm sure many of you do, especially if you're children of the 80s like me, but I actually have a close personal connection here with the show because many of the interesting government, science experiment type of things that occur were based off events that supposedly happened very near where I grew up in Long Island. So between that, various occult dabblings throughout my life, and some of my own strange things, I think I have a unique perspective here that I'd love to share. So with that, I invite you to join me to get into the Halloween and Stranger Things spirit and take a look at the top 10 Stranger Things that were my life. And before we begin, spoiler alert for the first season. Number 10, sensory deprivation. Throughout Season 1, the character of Eleven uses not only a bona fide sensory deprivation tank, but later a salt bath to essentially quiet her external stimuli so she can focus internally and project her consciousness outside of her body. There is actually a lot of precedent for this sort of idea, as, for example, tales of the ancient Greek oracles seem to involve similar techniques, and it also bears similarity to certain types of Buddhist meditation. Where this ties into my own life is with a kind of unintentional sensory deprivation, sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is basically when your mind wakes up before your body does, or your body goes to sleep before your mind does, which can lead to all sorts of crazy sensations, like feeling like you're being held down, or that you're being somehow dislodged from your body. And basically as a child, this used to happen to me every night, and it was pretty terrifying. Where it gets interesting, though, is that perhaps because of this hallucinatory kind of nature of this hypnagogic state, as it's called, many have linked sleep paralysis with psychic abilities and out-of-body experiences, etc. I had read about this when I was young, so I, in a sense, tried to use my unintentional sensory deprivation as a kind of training tool for these out-of-body experiences. But actually, this sensory deprivation feature is what kind of scared me off as a child, because I couldn't feel myself breathing anymore, and the panic would snap me out of it. I do have some ideas on how to move past this and achieve 11 level powers, but we'll see. Number 9, walkie-talkies and old-school electronics. When I was growing up in the 80s, my whole family ran an appliance store called Marlin TV that had all kinds of crazy gadgets, including that model of realistic walkie-talkies the kids used in the show. Some of my fondest memories as a child involved sitting on the benches in that store, pretending I was a Ghostbuster while playing with an oscilloscope or something. I remember there was this one guy, Larry, there, who would always be checking his remote controls by lighting up the eyes of some laser robot he had. But then there was that time when this guy came into the store with a shotgun, asking which one of us is Larry. Apparently science is neat, but not very forgiving. Thinking back to the walkie-talkies makes me laugh how much of old-school horror movie plots would be completely invalidated if everyone had a cell phone. This also brings us to number 8, Dragon's Lair. We actually had this arcade cabinet in Marlin TV, and I remember everybody flipping out about it. In retrospect, it really wasn't that great of a game, because it was really just more of an interactive movie. That didn't stop us from being in awe of that sweet, sweet Don Bluth animation, though. I wonder where that arcade cabinet is now. Number 7, dark arcades. The good old smoky, dark, somewhat dangerous arcade was a hallmark of the 80s, and was one of my favorite places to be. There was this whole culture there that doesn't seem to exist now, of kind of putting your quarters up next to somebody, lining them up so you can challenge them in Mortal Kombat, or whatever the flavor of the week was. There was just more of this slightly illicit vibe that was just very cool. Console games are probably what killed this culture, although some aspect of it still survives in your Jillians and your Dave & Buster's, but I just find those places to be so nauseating with the loud music and spinning lights. Interesting fun fact, both Mike and I from the Retromancers actually used to work in Jillian's back in the day. That job sucked. Number 6, those bedsheets. I actually had these exact bedsheets back in the day, when I wasn't rocking my He-Man bed tent. The one I had actually was a lot creepier than this one pictured here, and it had glow-in-the-dark Skeletor face that used to scare the crap out of me, but it was worth it anyway. Tents were actually totally my jam, and I used to make them out of everything as a kid. Tables, chairs, random sheets, people. I'd even make balconies and bathrooms and stuff. Much better than that sloppy shack Mike makes 11. I mean, come on. And of course, you had to ensure that everything is well defended from jet disc gun assaults. Remember those? Number 5, basement Dungeons and Dragons. Now we're talking. This is something I used to do all the time with my friends, just like the gang here. That's right, I was not dissuaded by the fear-mongering against D&D back in the day, led by none other than the nefarious Tom Hanks. I used to always get in trouble in middle school for reading Dragonlance books under my desk. To be fair, it was very rare we actually had a successful full-on campaign. Most of the time was spent just actually reading all the awesome books, the Player's Handbook, the Monstrous Compendium, all that stuff. We did eventually take the lazy way out though, and play a lot of Hero Quest. I remember my friend Anthony always used a barbarian named Jiznak the Gusher. Good times. It's also cool to note that the Demogorgon was featured, I believe, in the early Monstrous Compendiums, and that the Veil of Shadows, Upside Down, did have a number of equivalents. This leads me to number 4, the works of H.P. Lovecraft. For those unfamiliar, H.P. Lovecraft created stories based on impossibly huge and inscrutable cosmic entities that drive mankind to madness from the shadows. And though he still isn't quite a household name, the influence of his works are incredibly far-reaching, including being all over Dungeons & Dragons and video games. One of the interesting things he did would be to describe something by describing what it is not, never providing a clear understanding of what you're dealing with. You can perhaps see a graphical representation of this vagueness in the Season 2 trailer in the way that the supposed Thessal Hydra's form is a little bit immaterial. My introduction to Lovecraft came with the Necronomicon. No, not the flesh book from Evil Dead, but the ravings of the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred. Contrary to popular belief, this Necronomicon is not some sort of satanic work, but is based off of essentially a story within a story in Lovecraft's books, where he talks about these writings by the mad Arab that details accounts of these old ones, the inscrutable gods. As a bit of a deep dive side note, kind of reminds me a bit of the Claviculus Solumnus, or the Lesser Key of Solomon. I was given the book by my crazy friend Rob Gelhaus, who we called Rob Hellhouse, probably for reasons like this. Thanks, Rob. Number 3, psychic ability. What kid doesn't want to have X-Men psychic powers? And when I was growing up, I went on a deep dive occult adventure, a little bit at odds with my current form of a scientist, into all related subject matter. Psychometry, tarot cards, telekinesis, out-of-body projections, and spent countless hours reading books, trying meditation techniques. This wasn't just an idle hobby. I really wanted to figure out if anything was possible here. Back in the day, I even created a computer system to see if precognition could be provable, and discussed this at length with the noted skeptic, the amazing James Randi. In the end, while I can't say I became 11, I can say I learned a lot of interesting things, like for example how a lot of what you see 11 go through is based off of rumored government programs. For example, in the scene where you see 11 kind of channeling the words of a Russian soldier, this could be considered a form of what was called remote viewing that the US government was looking into, basically kind of trying to psychically spy. In actuality, what Stranger Things has done here is kind of combine remote viewing here with a version of the MK Ultra story. The form that I originally heard was that the government was testing psychotropic drugs to make soldiers become aggressive. So more like a super soldier serum in that sort of way, not so much the psychic way. But again, Stranger Things kind of seems to combine these ideas, along with some aspects of, say, quantum mechanics and multiverse theories. Very cool. One thing I'd like to say here is that while I do think it is very valuable to be skeptical, I think any scientist should always keep in their mind that anything is possible and be open to new information. For example, it doesn't seem crazy to me that some form of what we would call psychic ability could be possible based on some kind of quantum entanglement feature that we don't really understand yet. Gravity was once magic after all. Number 2, Commodore 64. Now here's something I don't think I've seen shouted out yet. But as I was watching the scene of Will here getting experimented on by the Hawking scientists, I'm looking at the screens, and I'm looking over to my right over here where I still have my original Commodore 64 monitor. I'm going, wait a minute. Boom! Definitely a Commodore 64 monitor. And I just think that is awesome because the C64 was a big part of my childhood. One of my favorite memories is waiting, a half hour for the damn games to load and pressuring my brother to play Mail Order Monster with me because that game was my jam. For those of you too young to get this, the Commodore 64 was basically one of the first big home computers. I think it was before the Apple IIe. It was kind of an unregulated Wild West where people were just making games in their garage and there was just a bajillion games. And with that amount of selection, you were just bound to find tons that were awesome and weird. My brother actually used to sell bootlegs out of his jacket on the street corner. And he and his friend's hacker group name was the Satan's Helpers. So if anyone out there has a Satan's Helper Commodore 64 disc, definitely let me know. Anyway, big credit to the Duffer Brothers for hitting all these crazy details that most people are probably never going to notice. Can't wait to keep my eyes peeled during Season 2 and see what we'll find. Before we get on to my number 1, I just want to hit a few honorable mentions here. Ghostbusters. If you grew up in the 80s, you were saturated with Ghostbusters everything, and that was a good thing. We're talking Commodore 64 games, old cartoons, new cartoons, Firehouse toys, proton packs, all of it. Love it. One of the funniest movies of all time. Will's House. I know this might sound like a strange thing, but something about the furniture and the wood wall paneling kind of bleeding over from the 70s into the 80s just really struck me and reminded me of my own house growing up in the early 80s and just hit me in the feels for some reason. That happen to anyone else? That bowl-shaped haircut, though. Yeah, I rocked it, and rocked it proud. Come at me. Microfiche. When's the last time you saw that? I remember sifting through this was an utter nightmare, and I can't honestly remember how we managed when it came to digging up old news reports. On the plus side, this reminds me of the good old Seaford Public Library back in the day. I would even go so far as to say, it was cooler than the Hawkins Public Library. And now for the top Stranger Things thing that was my life, secret government experiments. So as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the events that happen in Stranger Things are inspired by rumored government experiments, and one of the key sites in these rumors is a place called Camp Hero, an old military base on Montauk, Long Island. It was once part of the Montauk Air Force Station at the very tip of Long Island, New York. It is this place that is the focus of one of the most pervasive urban legends of government experimentation, called the Montauk Project, that was supposedly centered on the idea of developing psychological warfare techniques and research involving time travel and cloaking. One of the stories that I heard when I was researching this back in the day was that there was supposed to be some kind of chair or chamber that you sit in that would make your thoughts real in some way, like the idea of a tulpa or thought form. And through this aspect of things, Camp Hero is also sometimes tied to the Philadelphia experiment, which may be a little bit more of a well-known urban legend, in which a governmental experiment in radar cloaking is rumored to have gone wrong, ending up supposedly turning a Navy ship, the USS Eldridge, actually invisible, only to reappear far away with the matter all jumbled up, people phased into walls, etc. The connection here being that the Montauk Project was used to create the Philadelphia experiment, someone sitting in the magic chair and thinking of the ship being cloaked, but screwing up pretty hard. Now again, these are all heavily disputed urban legends with a lot of different versions, but interesting nonetheless. So what about my personal connection here? Well, back in the day, these stories impelled a friend of mine, Brett, to join me in taking trips out to Montauk from our sleepy little town in Nassau County and see what we could find. Now, one thing you might know if you've ever traveled east on Long Island is that basically all the major roads kind of collapse into just one as you're going out there. And as you drive down, you can sort of see Camp Hero in the distance and the fabled radio tower that factors prominently in the urban legends. So we thought it would be a cool idea to try and find this. But as you continue to get closer to Montauk, the elevation decreases, you kind of lose the vantage point, and you can't really clearly see where you are in relation to that when you get down to the town. So we decided to kind of drive in the direction that we thought it was, but as you might expect, the area around the military base is heavily guarded, so we couldn't go through, and just started wandering around the side roads. I remember one such road looked to be in a particularly sorry state, dilapidated windmills and rusted wheelbarrows, etc., going into barren farmland to nowhere in a distant forest, and with signs that said no trespassing, strangely. So of course, let's go that way. So we drive all the way down, and it eventually becomes a densely wooded forest, in which the road eventually just dead ends, strangely. So we get out of the car, start poking around, and what do we find in the thick brush but some sort of keypad access code console like out of Spaceballs. And looking a little further through the dense brush, we can see in the distance what looks like that same building where the radio tower is. But the strange thing was, in looking at the top of the building, no radio tower. Now the most obvious answer here is we had the wrong building, but this got my head spinning a little bit. Well, the whole myths here involve some sort of cloaking device, so wouldn't it be interesting if this was the building, but somehow from our angle we couldn't see the radio tower? Kind of like a magnetic field that has two weak points at the poles. What if there was some sort of cloaking device here? And that point when we're cresting the ridge driving down is positioned at one of those two areas, and the cloaking wouldn't work. Now obviously that's all speculation, and Occam's razor would just say it's the wrong building, But this was just one of the many moments from my childhood that made me go, and I figured that the occasion of Stranger Things' return would be an excellent time to share it with you all. Anyway, thanks for watching this video and hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to let us know any of your own Stranger Things things in the comments. If you're getting into the Halloween spirit and retro games are your thing, then feel free to check out our perfect run of Friday the 13th on the NES. Also, please check out my friend Square Painter, who did this awesome painting for me of the Stranger Things kids in the style of Earthbound on Super Nintendo. Please subscribe, hit that bell looking thing for updates, eat some Eggos, and we'll see you next time on the Retromancers.